Well, welcome everyone to the webinar on the release of the BC chapter of Canada and a Changing Climate, a Regional Perspectives Report. Thank you for being here to hear some highlights from many of the authors who are involved in this report. My name is Jim Vanderwall, and on behalf of the Fraser Basin Council, I want to welcome you here. We have people from all around British Columbia as well as other parts of Canada. Erin, do you want to share the poll? We can kind of see where attendees are from. So it's great to see people from all over BC, as well as some folks from the prairies in Ontario and even Atlantic. The Fraser Basin Council is a nonprofit organization with a mandate to advance sustainability in British Columbia. And I want to just acknowledge my colleagues, Erin Peterson and Tanya Hebron, who are helping to moderate and facilitate the session today as well. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining from unceded Syilx or Okanagan territory, otherwise known as Vernon, British Columbia. And it's part of our journey as an organization to understand what that means. And I'm afraid too often it stops at that, and acknowledging territory can be a little bit performative. So I want to take a little bit of time to remember a colleague of ours who's no longer with us, but has passed on, George Saddleman, who was a chief and a councillor with Upper Nicola. So he was a part of the Okanagan Nation and was a founding director on our board for the Insulation language group. And he taught us about the importance of what he called, the word in Insulation is Trukstam. Probably not saying that very well, but it's really a word about sustaining the land, looking after the land, sustaining the diversity of species and their habitats in perpetuity for the well-being of future generations. So I'd encourage you all to take some time to consider where you are, the territory that you're in, and what that might mean for you and the work that you're doing. Certainly the work around climate change and future climate is important in how future generations are able to live on the land. So today we're going to be hearing from a number of authors of this assessment who brought their expertise in specific subject areas. And of course, this report and the webinar take on a special significance given the year that we've been through in British Columbia in 2021. So we don't need to be convinced here. I don't think that climate change is already happening. And for those of us that have been working on climate impacts and adaptation, 2021 was a year that the events we talk about became real, and our friends and neighbors were personally impacted. So reports like this help to summarize the information available, synthesize research on how climate is and will impact British Columbia. Just a couple of technical notes here. My colleagues, Erin and Tanya, are, as I mentioned, are working with me to moderate, and there is information on the chat. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can email Erin at epedersen@fraserbasin.ca. That should be in the chat. We will be recording the webinar today and posting it on our events page, so you can view it after. And I also want to acknowledge the support of Natural Resources Canada, both for development of this chapter, of course, as well as for putting this webinar on. So we do have a number of speakers, and we'll have to move through this in an organized way. But we do welcome your questions. So there is a Q&A panel. So please feel free to type in those questions as they come to you in the question box. And we'll be moderating 2 question periods, one partway through and one at the end of the webinar to break things up. And I'll moderate those questions as we receive them. And if we aren't able to get to your questions, we'll do our best to pass on the questions to the speakers and hope to get answers to those questions. So we have an hour and a half here together, and we'll make the best use of our time. So before we begin, we do have some recorded remarks from the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, who is the Member of Parliament for North Vancouver and also the Minister of Natural Resources Canada, to welcome us here to the webinar today.
Hello, everyone. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am joining you from my constituency office in North Vancouver, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam peoples. As a minister from British Columbia, I am pleased to speak to you today regarding the release of the BC chapter of regional assessments. Having previously served as the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and now as Minister of Natural Resources, I know that Canada has made unprecedented progress in the fight against climate change, but I also know we still have much more work to do. Par exemple, nous parlons beaucoup d'atténuation, c'est-à-dire de réduire la gravité des changements climatiques en diminuant les émissions de gaz à effet de serre, et nous devons le faire. Mais nous devons aussi parler franchement de l'importance de l'adaptation, c'est-à-dire de prévoir les impacts du changement climatique et de poser les gestes nécessaires pour assurer la sécurité et la prospérité de nos collectivités, de notre économie et de notre environnement. According to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the total insured damages from weather-related events last year was $2.1 billion, the sixth highest year for insured losses since 1983. That alone tells us that mitigation and adaptation must be pursued in tandem. The science is also clear that the changes will continue. Each of the last 3 decades have been the warmest on record. Certainly, anyone who lives here in British Columbia is well aware that extreme weather events are having a profound impact on Canadians' health and well-being and our economy. Last year alone, we witnessed the atmospheric river event in November that brought record precipitation to many areas of southern BC, causing landslides, destroying highways, and sadly, resulting in deaths. Au plus fort de l'été, la majeure partie de la Colombie-Britannique a connu une canicule sans précédent avec des températures records qui ont engendré 526 décès et qui a réduit la quasi-totalité de la ville de Lytton en cendres. Le mois dernier, la Colombie-Britannique était déjà aux prises avec environ 70 feux de forêt. Ces événements extrêmes nous rappellent qu'il ne s'agit plus de se demander si nous devons agir pour lutter contre les changements climatiques, mais bien comment nous devons le faire. Which is why the release of the latest chapter in our Regional Perspectives report is so important. As part of our ongoing series of national assessment reports, written from a British Columbia perspective, this report details what we already know through our lived experience as British Columbians. The climate crisis is having a deep and lasting impact on our communities, their economies, and the environment, and not just the extreme weather events we read about in the press. Even gradual changes in temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise in BC require adaptation action. This report entails a few inescapable conclusions. First, Indigenous peoples in BC are uniquely impacted by climate change, but they have also been uniquely resilient as a result of Indigenous knowledge systems. Adaptation efforts are more likely to succeed when they are created in concert with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous knowledge is critical because it provides informed and actionable solutions throughout all aspects of climate change adaptation planning. Effective adaptation strategies must include Indigenous knowledge. Second, climate change is bringing increasing flood risks, and BC's water resources will continue to see significant changes as the climate warms, with flooding causing some of the most significant damage to our farms and highways, while summer heat and droughts continue to ravage BC's interior in the summer months. Third, climate change is also having an impact on British Columbia's forests. Forest fires and the spread of pine beetle are affecting forest productivity, wildlife habitat, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. And finally, climate change has already had an impact on food production in the province. Much of the Lower Mainland's agricultural activity occurs below sea level. Our farmers face the dual threat of flooding from the mountains on one side and ever-rising sea levels on the other. Local vineyards and orchards in the Okanagan face longer dry seasons, higher temperatures, and lower reservoirs every year. Building a climate-ready agriculture sector will be critical. Cela dit, nous faisons des progrès. Nous voyons des mesures d'adaptation contre le changement climatique qui donnent d'excellents résultats partout dans la province et ces mesures évaluent au quotidien. Et c'est grâce à un meilleur accès à des données climatiques, à des outils d'aide à la décision, à du financement et au soutien de la part de diverses institutions. Nous devons poursuivre sur cette lancée. I think we can all agree climate change is a collective problem that requires shared responsibility. All levels of government have a critical role to play in finding and implementing long-term solutions. Our government is actively developing a national adaptation strategy to support the collaboration we need and to deliver Canadians the support they deserve. That is why our assessment reports are essential. They help inform sound, thoughtful action. Canada's climate is changing, and we need to adapt to ensure our communities, our environment, and our economies can be resilient. By working together, we can build a future that works for all regions of our country, for all parts of our economy, and for all Canadians. Thank you very much. Hello.
Great, thanks very much, and we appreciate the opening remarks from the minister. To get us started here, can we just get the slides up, please, Tanya? As I mentioned, we do have a number of speakers here who participated in different aspects, different sections of the BC chapter. And so we're going to begin with Fiona Warren, who's the Knowledge Assessment Manager for Natural Resources Canada. And Fiona will be giving us an overview of the assessment process from her perspective. So I'm going to hand things over to Fiona at this time.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. Can we have the next slide, please? The next slide. Perfect, thanks. So yeah, I am so excited to be here today for the release of the BC chapter. This chapter really represents the hard work, the dedication, and the persistence of so many people over really quite a few years now. So I'm extremely proud of what was accomplished, especially in light of some of the challenges and delays we faced as a result of the pandemic. So before I jump right in, I just want to quickly acknowledge and thank the contributing authors, the coordinating authors, the lead authors, the reviewers, the advisory committee, and especially the swell secretariat at NRCan, who keep everything moving along so well. Next slide, please. So today I'm just going to talk for, it'll be less than 10 minutes, about 8 minutes. So I'll introduce assessments and talk about our process. And then I'll introduce you to the Regional Perspectives Report, of which the BC chapter is a part, and then conclude with a few slides on digital delivery. Then I'll hand it back over to the lead authors to talk about the key findings of the chapter. Next slide, please. So before I get into the details of our assessment process specifically, I just want to explain what we mean when we say assessments. So in this case, we're talking about processes and products, often reports, that are designed to really be credible, useful, and decision relevant. They always synthesize existing knowledge, and in this case, they focus on climate change impacts, opportunities, and adaptation. The goals of our assessment are to raise awareness of key issues, to provide a foundation for decision-making, but not to direct decision-making because they are not designed to be policy prescriptive. And another goal is to build capacity on adaptation through the assessment development process. So in terms of the scope and the goals and the approach, they're quite similar to those of the Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. At NRCan, we've been leading the national assessment process since the mid-2000s, and we are currently in our third assessment cycle. Next slide, please. So we're currently, we launched this process back in, very end of 2016, early 2017. So the process is called Canada in a Changing Climate, Advancing Our Knowledge for Action. So over these years, we are producing a total of 6 reports, which is really quite ambitious for us. And the reason we could do this is because of the great partnerships and collaborations we have with so many groups across the country. So the first report to be released under the process was co-led between NRCan and Environment and Climate Change Canada, and that was Canada's Changing Climate Report, and it looks at how and why Canada's climate is changing. The second report to be released was the National Issues Report, led by our team at NRCan. That was released in June 2021, and it looked at issues that were of national importance or that were best understood through an integrated pan-Canadian perspective. So for example, some of the topics covered included cities and towns, ecosystem services, economic sectors, costs and benefits of climate change, and international dimensions, amongst others. The third report to be released was produced by Health Canada, and that was the health of Canadians in a changing climate. And that was released just earlier this year, I believe in February. And we're currently in the process of releasing the Regional Perspectives Report. We're releasing that on a chapter by chapter basis. So now we're at the third chapter to be released, which is the BC chapter. Over the coming year, we will also be releasing 2 additional reports. One will be a standalone Indigenous report, and the other will be the enhanced synthesis, which will draw from all the reports in the process. And it's very exciting that all of these reports are or will be available at the same website at changingclimate.ca. Next slide, please. So the Regional Perspectives Report, of which the BC chapter is a part, provides regional perspectives on how climate change is impacting our communities, our environment, and our economy, and also looks at how we are adapting in the different regions. So throughout each of the chapters, there are many examples of adaptation in practice through case stories and also through the discussion. And as I mentioned, they're being released on a rolling basis. The first one was the Prairie Provinces chapter, released in December 2020, followed by the Atlantic Provinces chapter in December 2021. Today, very exciting to be releasing the BC chapter, and the remaining 3 chapters, Ontario, Quebec, and Northern Canada, will be released over the coming months. Next slide, please. So as I said, the reason we can be so ambitious in the process is because we work with such a wonderful large group of experts from all across the country. So in the case of the Regional Perspectives Report alone, over 230 experts. These experts come from many different groups, including all levels of government, NGOs, the private sector, professional associations, Indigenous organizations, as well as in this case, some members of the public. The different roles in the assessment are shown here. So for this particular report, there were 17 coordinating lead authors. So these authors pulled the content together, pulled the writing team together, and were ultimately responsible for delivering the chapters. There are also 100 contributing authors who contributed their expertise to provide specific sections for the chapters, as well as case stories. A review process is extremely important to any assessment, as it helps ensure that the content is accurate and relevant. And in this case, we had 100 expert reviewers contribute to the report overall. And we also have a 20-member advisory committee, the Assessment Advisory Committee, an amazing group of primarily assessment users who have been with us all the way since 2017, providing advice, ideas, and recommendations along the way. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're currently in our 3rd assessment cycle, and we were really fortunate this time to have the support and the encouragement to do some things differently, to really try to improve the process as well as the products. So I just have some highlights of what was new this time here. First of all, as I mentioned, there are 6 reports over this process, quite a change from our past processes where we delivered a single report, or sometimes 2 reports. We also put a much greater focus on really increasing the transparency by enhancing the engagement and communications, giving more people the opportunity to contribute throughout the entire process. So right from the scoping phase to the post-release stage. We've also presented the information in a slightly different way this time, using a key message approach, which allowed the authors to really focus on the key issues for the specific regions or the sectors, but also allowed us to present the information in layers or tiers to address the different needs of different audiences. We also put a much stronger focus on including multiple sources of knowledge. And this is really reflected in the fact that in the previous 2 assessment cycles we talked about, or the phrase we used was a science assessment, but based on discussions with our advisory committee and others early in the process, we switched the terminology to a knowledge assessment to really reflect that we're going much broader than just the published scientific literature to really include multiple sources of knowledge. So the local knowledge, practitioner knowledge, and especially Indigenous knowledge in this case. For the first time, we also explicitly asked the authors to discuss knowledge gaps and emerging issues within each chapter. And what this does is help us establish a baseline for future reports. And it also it will help direct research as well. And finally, one of the most significant changes is that all our products were designed for digital delivery as opposed to being designed for print as they were in the past. And I'll talk more to that on the next slide. So by using a digital first approach, we were able to do many, incorporate new elements, and some of them are summarized here. First is that we can embed videos throughout the site, which is really great because it allows people to talk to their adaptation experiences in their own voices. There's also many illustrative, beautiful photos throughout the site. All of the content within the web pages are shareable. All the content is shareable and it's also searchable. And I find that feature extremely useful for myself when I want to quickly track down some facts or figures. All the figures on the website are downloadable, so they can be used in presentations or reports, and some of these are interactive. There are also, the digital approach also allows us to provide the hyperlinks between the different sections and reports. And this has turned out to be a really great feature because it allows us, for example, when ecosystem services are mentioned in the BC chapter, we can link readers directly to the ecosystem services chapter itself to get more context and background on the concepts. We also have a frequently asked questions part, as well as a case story map, which I'll talk to on the next slide. But before we go there, I just want to point out that for people who prefer to print and read documents, all the chapters of reports are also available as accessible PDFs on the NRCan website and at changingclimate.ca. Next slide, please. So also at changingclimate.ca, there is what is called the Map of Adaptation Actions. And this was a joint initiative, again, with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And what it is an interactive searchable database and a map that has examples of adaptation in practice all across Canada. They come from a large range of sources, including the case stories within the national assessment process itself. The map is targeted primarily towards decision makers and adaptation practitioners. And I apologize that the figure on the screen here is a little bit dated. I did do a search of the map, I think just a week ago, and there are currently 62 case studies for the province of BC, and they focus on a wide range of issues covering topics such as flooding, wildfire, mental health, and transportation. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I do encourage everyone to visit changingclimate.ca. That's where you'll access the BC chapter, as well as the other reports that I mentioned that are published. If you're interested in learning more about the process, you can visit our website at adaptation.nrcan.gc.ca. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out by email, either to our generic adaptation mailbox, the address is here, or myself directly. So with that, I will thank everyone very much for participating today. It's great to see such a great number. I'm really looking forward to the presentations by the authors, and I will pass it back to you, Jim.
Thanks very much, Fiona, and thanks for all your work in keeping this process going. And it's great to be at this point as one of the people on the advisory committee to see this product now launched. So we're going to hear from 3 of the chapter authors, and then before we go to Q&A, starting with just a short chapter overview by Craig Brown. Craig is the coordinating lead author of the BC chapter, and he's also the climate change and health lead at Vancouver Coastal Health. So I'll pass it over to you, Craig.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you. I'll echo everyone's thanks for all of you that are taking the time to tune in today. I scrolled through the attendees list. It's so nice to see so many familiar names and new names. I wish we were doing this in person somehow, but this is such a great way to reach so many of you. So I've been really, really grateful to contribute to this process. I'm, personally really motivated by evidence-based decision-making and by the extent of the challenges that we face here in British Columbia, whether from warming temperatures or changing precipitation patterns that mean everything from droughts to more atmospheric rivers and flooding, our changing ocean conditions and ecosystems, increased wildfire risk, you name it. It was really great to be a part of a process that gave us all an opportunity to bring together as much of the information around the impacts that those hazards cost as well or cause, as well as the the adaptation progress and options. To bring all of that information together in one place was really an exciting opportunity. It was also great to be a part of such a great team. Fiona kind of mentioned it. I got to be a co-coordinator lead author along with my colleague Bob Gifford from University of Victoria, and we were joined by an amazing team of lead and contributing authors, many of whom are on the call today, but also this legion of reviewers and folks that we were able to engage with throughout the process, and of course NRCan, who has fearlessly shepherded us for the last 4.5, 5 years. It's been a great process and really neat to see that team effort. We're thankful today. We have 2 authors for most of the sections in the chapter, and we're really lucky to have an author that can speak to each of the sections today. So it'll kind of keep it varied and make sure that we have the subject matter expertise on the line. We, in designing this chapter, we kind of like Fiona said, we wanted to make sure that it was responsive, I guess, to the knowledge users' needs. We wanted to produce something that was credible and user-friendly and relevant. And so one of the ways to do that was to engage experts and decision makers throughout the process. So we did that in the creation of our key messages and deciding how to scope the chapter. And we did it a couple times when asking for review. And some of you on the line probably offered that review. So thank you again for that. In addition to the engagement and making sure that we were responsive, we also wanted to make sure that the chapter kind of was situated within all of the existing and forthcoming work. This includes a 2008 chapter on British Columbia from a previous national assessment. It also includes recent chapters from a coastal and transportation assessments that are a little more recent. As many of you know, BC has a preliminary strategic climate risk assessment. So we tried to include that and not kind of duplicate some of the work that was done in those other products. We also really benefited from Canada's Changing Climate Report, which I'm sure many of you use in your day-to-day work as the kind of primary source and go-to resource for our climate projections for British Columbia. Just a tremendous piece of work. Another thing to mention is that this assessment is quite large, and there are those other chapters that we knew that we wanted to be in a complementary relationship with. So sector impacts and adaptation, cities and towns, and others. We wanted to, again, make sure that we were producing content that was distinct but complementary. And of course, at the time of writing the health assessment, the National Health Assessment had not yet come out. That's out now on changingclimate.ca. and the Indigenous Resilience Report that's forthcoming. So just a ton of information that we wanted to produce something that was relevant within that constellation of products, while also being responsive, like I said, to those that we engaged. And this is really challenging. Thank heavens for the map that Fiona showed just a few slides ago. For many of you, you know that even from week to week, but certainly from month to month, this adaptation landscape in BC changes. There can be new teams and new funding opportunities and new projects. And so our job of trying to assess that knowledge at a point in time, it can be really challenging to make sure that you've been as comprehensive as possible. But we're, like Fiona said, we're really, really proud of what we've produced. I think there's a ton of great information in here, the case stories, there's graphics and images that we hope you can use in your work. And on that note, I think in a little bit, we'll be posting a link to some communication materials that have been developed for the chapter as well, infographics, tweet cards, other things that can make it easy for us to share information as an author team, but to even get in the hands of you and to have you spread through your networks as well. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'll cover what the minister did so well, which is just take you through the 5 key areas that are covered in this chapter. I won't go into detail. These are shortened key message statements here that you can see on the screen. But as the minister mentioned, I'll just reiterate, we've got 5 key areas. The first dealing with Indigenous impacts and adaptation, the second with flooding, the third with forestry, the fourth with agriculture, and the fifth to kind of convey the state of adaptation in BC. And like I said, we've got an author from each of those sections to speak to today, which is really nice. And I believe at this point, I will turn it over back to Jim so that we can dive right into the first key message. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So We'll first hear from Denise Clement. Denise is the chapter lead author for the Indigenous Impacts and Adaptation section of the chapter. And so I'll hand it over to her.
Great. Gisik Yukia to everybody. Good afternoon. Husukaf Gukini, Nausan Mietki, Hugaklikinis Mumbaski. My name is Denise Clement, and I'm from the Ktunaxa Nation, which is located in the southeastern part of BC. And I also have roots in Cascadene territory. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the Lekwungen territory, known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. So I am passionate about Indigenous sustainability and resilience. I began as a youth organizer for my community, Akam, in 2001. And then I also worked for the Climate Action Secretariat in 2015. And since then have supported multiple ministries to engage Indigenous communities on climate change. In 2020, I joined Pinna Sustainability, and through that role, I am the Climate Action Network lead for the Coastal First Nations. And the Coastal First Nations created in 2019 a network that supports its member communities to advance their community climate priorities. So we have a coordinator in each of their 8 communities, and the network supports these coordinators through mentorship, training, peer support, and other capacity development needs that they might have. So that's a really exciting initiative that is happening and that I'm part of, and we're also going to be expanding to support 24 remote Indigenous communities in BC. So that's one exciting opportunity to share, and there's a lot of adaptation work going on in those communities as well. So just a bit about the approach before I jump into the findings is that just want to say that it's been an honor to be asked to write the Indigenous Adaptations and Impacts section of the BC chapter. And it was really important to me and the rest of the team to do a good job. Our goal was to respectfully include Indigenous perspectives and knowledge and to make space for this type of knowledge, as Fiona mentioned, expanding what we're considering and including in this assessment, and not just scientific knowledge, but also making space for Indigenous knowledge, which is really important and exciting. One way that we did this is, again, to have a specific section as well as to have a strength-based approach. So ensuring that we're recognizing community strengths and knowledge, and really trying to also have positive messaging and uplifting messaging. Also, I interviewed knowledge holders across BC to help guide the writing of this section. As well, there was an opportunity for communities to write their community story, so they could actually have the pen and tell their a more fulsome story. And I think some of those stories are on the adaptation map. So there were some challenges, just to recognize that this, again, is like a new approach, and that traditionally there's been underrepresentation of Indigenous knowledge in climate change assessments. So we are really, doing the best we could to develop this new approach and to be respectful. Also recognizing that Indigenous communities come from oral traditions, so a lot of Indigenous knowledge is not written. So we did our best to reference sources that were also written, and also to protect some of the sacredness as well, and making choices about what we do share. Yeah, so I will just start to speak now to the findings. First Nations are experiencing impacts including access to cultural sites, including traditional foods and medicine, and that these climate impacts present distinctive challenges to Indigenous communities, and that this is an important key message that needs to be understood, is that the impacts are unique. The climate change impacts First Nations inherent rights and title, as well as our unique interconnection to our homelands and territories, as well as our worldviews and cultures that are intrinsic and interdependent with our spiritual relationship to our natural environment. And that there are factors that exacerbate these impacts, such as the ongoing and legacy of colonization, as well as other inequities and systemic racism. Also, things like the location of reserves really impact how we experience climate change as well. And some Indigenous peoples even see climate change as another face of colonization. So Indigenous-led adaptation efforts are emerging in many Indigenous communities across BC. And Indigenous communities are at various stages in addressing climate change. Several Indigenous communities have developed adaptation plans and risk assessments, such as Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And also each community has a unique history, experience, and distinct perspective on BC's changing climate. And it's critical to the development, oftentimes it's critical to the development of these plans, is the multi-generational knowledge of these communities and their connection to their territories, which dates back thousands of years. And more work is needed to develop processes for meaningful engagement and partnership with Indigenous peoples, including the development of opportunities to define climate planning, as well as initiatives and priorities. And just to, again, reiterate that Indigenous knowledge and experiences have been underrepresented, and need to, more work is needed for Indigenous knowledge to be brought into assessments, as well as other policies and laws and climate initiatives. And this is an ongoing challenge. And just to want to point to the good work that's being done on the Indigenous Resilience chapter that will be coming out later, and that this will also provide a more fulsome understanding of Indigenous knowledge across the country. And yeah, really looking forward to the good work that's being done there. If we could go to the next slide. We wanted to highlight one important initiative. So the First Nations Leadership Council recently released the BC First Nations Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan. They released this recently on April 22nd of this year. And just so you know, the First Nations Leadership Council represents 3 First Nations political organizations in BC. And this plan was informed through by BC First Nations priorities and knowledge. There was an extensive engagement process, as well as a working group that led the process. The plan includes strategies and actions to reduce GHG or greenhouse gas emissions, as well to strengthen Indigenous climate leadership in BC, to reduce vulnerabilities to impacts, as well as to build capacity, understanding, and resilience in First Nations communities. The plan is comprehensive. It has a vision, guiding principles, 4 different pathways, as well as strategies and actions, and 20 urgent calls to action. And it also highlights where external organizations and governments can also be part of the plan. And I just wanted to highlight that one of the foundational pathways is about respecting inherent title and rights, and that this is an essential building block for First Nations climate action. And that they also highlight that First Nations must be treated as true and equal partners in climate planning and response. So I feel like this is such a good initiative, and it gives so much more information, and that it's a good thing to also look to for more information and more ideas on actions to be taken. And then next slide. So just to finish on a really positive story, I'm very excited about this initiative that we're able to do through this work. So we created an Indigenous Youth Climate Art Contest. In 2019, we invited Indigenous youth living in BC to submit proposals of art reflecting their perspectives on a changing climate. And so 5 artists were chosen, and they each created art, as well as shared their perspectives on what their art how their art represents their perspectives on the changing climate. And I just highlighted this specific art piece by Sarah Jim, who's a Wasanich, and her piece is titled Saltwater Ways. And her piece highlights the interconnection between all living things, but in particular, the orca, the salmon, as well as native plants. As you can see, the salmon is inside the orca, and it's in this nice circle to show that interconnection and how important that is. Yeah, so we wanted to find a way to include Indigenous youth voices, and this was the way that we came up with. And yeah, I just have a lot of gratitude for this process and all the learning that I've had throughout the last several years. And yeah, I'm appreciative to the Fraser Basin Council and the coordinating lead authors and everyone else, especially the knowledge holders who supported me along this journey. So thank you very much. And I hope you enjoy the chapter, and yeah, I just am really proud of this work and grateful for this opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. And thank you for sharing your work with us. And we really appreciated the opportunity to work with you on the Indigenous Youth Climate Art Contest. It was really great to see and to be able to showcase some of that work at Adaptation Canada 2020. We're going to move to our next speaker, who is Luke Sales, the chapter lead author, or one of the chapter lead authors, sorry, for the section on flooding and atmospheric rivers. And he is also the director of planning for the town of Qualicum Beach. So over to you, Luke.
Thank you very much, Jim. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It'd be great if it were in person, but here we are. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about the context of flooding in BC, some of the challenges we're experiencing, and some local examples of climate adaptation. And I would like to acknowledge Carrie Barron, who was my partner on this chapter, and she was instrumental in making it what it is. So thank you, Carrie, if you're listening. So British Columbia faces significant risks from coastal, riverine, and urban flooding. These flood events negatively impact critical infrastructure, services, ecosystems, health, and well-being. There are lots of good examples and examples of planning and action at different scales, but there's lots of challenges that still remain. These challenges involve overlapping jurisdictional mandates, long-term uncertainty, complex trade-offs, and limited human and financial resources. Communities throughout BC are proactively planning, designing, and implementing flood adaptation projects through local research and robust decision-making processes. Climate change adaptation engages multiple levels of government to both reduce climate change impacts and assist in community recovery following extreme climate events. Next slide. To put this in context, the Pacific Ocean produces an immense amount of precipitation, and that precipitation gets trapped in the western part of the province by the Coast and Cascade Mountains, making BC's west coast the wettest coast in Canada. So we call it the wet coast for that reason. The coastline extends more than 26,000 kilometers, boasting rich ecological diversity, beautiful scenery, and recreational opportunities. But with rising seas, storm intensity, and changing climate, this coastline is also a formidable vulnerability. The past climate is no longer a reliable indicator of future conditions, yet we have a province built around using the past as a reference for land use planning, infrastructure, and housing. Next slide. BC is drained by 6 major river systems and many more named and unnamed watercourses. Riverine flooding is widespread in BC and occurs when excessive rains or rapid snowmelt exceed the capacity of a river channel or stream bank. BC's Lower Mainland alone contains 600 kilometers of diking and 100 pump stations. Increasing temperatures and changes in seasonal precipitation will continue to alter patterns of water accumulation and discharge, including the timing of spring thaw, timing and duration of low flow periods, water temperatures, increased strength and frequency of atmospheric river events. These changes are also influenced by natural climate variability such as El Nino, La Nina. The atmospheric river event in November 2021 brought record precipitation to many communities in southern BC, leading to destructive flooding in many communities. Technically, that event is considered to be a 1 in 50 year, maybe a 1 in 100 year event, but those events are coming more frequently. So the economic impact of this extreme weather is extreme. Next slide. Many municipal and regional governments are currently engaged in planning activities to manage flood risk. Flood protection, accommodation, and retreat are the general adaptation approaches used to reduce the risk of sea level rise and flooding. There is an increased understanding of these approaches in many communities. Managed retreat via voluntary buyout is one important strategy that's often politically and emotionally charged, and that must consider efficiency, social acceptability, and political feasibility to be effective. There's one example in BC of this approach coming from Grand Forks, which was awarded funding from Infrastructure Canada's Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, in part to purchase properties located in floodplains. There's other examples, other municipalities where they purchase land to remove it from vulnerable areas. Adapting to climate change means changing buildings or infrastructure to withstand or accommodate the impacts of sea level rise. At a municipal level, this is primarily done through the BC Building Code and other planning authorities, such as development permit areas. Land use planning can prevent development in areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise. For example, City of Surrey has a policy to regulate development in 2 floodplain areas, restricting subdivision to limit the number of exposed businesses or residents. So if you can avoid putting people in risk, that's the best approach if possible. Combined with the city's hazard area development permit area requirement, the policy ensures that those living or reconstructing a building in a floodplain will have buildings constructed at safe elevations. An understanding of flood risks and subsequent land use planning are the foundations of this strategy. Adaptation decisions often require collaboration between different levels of government and First Nations. Waterfronts, for example, are within the jurisdiction of the government of BC to administer Crown land approvals, wildlife management areas, and then they're also within the jurisdiction of the government of Canada for the evaluation of impacts on fisheries and navigable waters. Then waterfront areas are also within the traditional territory of BC's First Nations. The City of Vancouver's sea level rise plan is informed by traditional Musqueam canoe landing protocols and requirements, a process that required a great deal of investment in trust building and collaboration. Suffice to say that waterfronts and rivers are very complex in terms of overlapping jurisdictions. As part of phase 1 of its Lower Mainland flood management strategy, the Fraser Basin Council projected the damage and direct and indirect economic losses in Lower Mainland floodplain areas that would result under different flood scenarios. This represents the most detailed study of economic impacts of flooding in BC. That's the slide you're looking at here. The numbers are definitely intimidating. Next slide. The capacity of BC local governments to respond to changing conditions varies greatly, as does the level of funding and support for adaptation and vulnerability reduction. Larger municipalities like Vancouver, Surrey, and Victoria have been able to source or leverage funding, while many smaller communities rely on support from higher levels of government. Furthermore, municipal governments do not have jurisdiction over placement of certain types of infrastructure, such as railways, ports, airports, hydro infrastructure, pipelines, ferry terminals, and highways. This infrastructure is often located in floodplains, placing it at risk to flooding, which requires collaborative adaptation efforts. In summary, British Columbia's water resources will continue to see significant changes as the climate warms, with flooding causing some of the most damaging and costly impacts. Many communities in BC are reducing their risks by proactively planning, designing, and implementing flood adaptation projects, but increased action is required across all scales. There are many positive examples of climate adaptation in BC, some of which are covered in this report, some of which you'd have to look to other sources. But there's still considerable work to be done. Local governments require more financial support, more reliable data and knowledge, stronger policies and plans from the federal and provincial levels, and additional human resources to improve flood risk management. There's a lot of incredible work, and I'm proud to have been able to share a bit of it with you today, but there's also a lot more work that still needs to be done. So I thank you for your time and welcome your questions later on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Luke, and appreciate you providing that overview on climate change and floods, certainly a very big topic in BC. We have a short time slot here for questions and answers. We're going to also do that later as well. In the interest of time, I think we're just going to take 1 or 2 questions now so that we can make sure to get through all the speakers before 2:30. And for those that are able to stay for 5 or 10 minutes more, perhaps we'll be able to answer a few more questions at that point as well. If we could just have some of the other speakers highlighted as well, Aaron, that would be great. One question, and maybe this is more for Craig or for Fiona, is just if this recently released chapter report is different from earlier reports because of the evolution in our knowledge of climate change hazards and impacts. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. It's a great question. And of course, we did our best to make sure that we built on previous reports. So the literature largely comes from, up to fall 2021. Then there's a few inclusions from after that. So it's, like I said in my introductory remarks, we try to produce as comprehensive of an assessment as possible. It certainly builds on our understanding of the hazards that we face, largely informed by Canada's Changing Climate Report that came out in 2019. It doesn't do any new climate science modeling or projections. It relies primarily on sources like that, but certainly new information about impacts, new information about adaptation, and some new approaches like Denny and Fiona mentioned. The inclusion of a multitude of knowledges represents an innovative approach and is bound to produce some new insights. So yeah, I would say a resounding yes to answer your question, and happy to chat more about that offline if you'd like to.
Okay, great. Thank you for handling that, Craig. Appreciate the response. The next question is for Denise. Do you have any suggestions for how climate data and providers can help ensure that the services that they provide are helpful for Indigenous peoples, governments, and organizations?
This is a really good question. And I feel like there's probably a number of ways to answer, but I think the first and foremost is to talk to Indigenous peoples and also perhaps even hire them. So you could do more fulsome engagement processes where you could talk to multiple First Nations or Indigenous people on what their needs are and try to find ways to meet those needs creatively. And yeah, and I also find that, it's really good to start from a place of understanding the context of where Indigenous peoples are coming from. And I'd point also to the First Nations lens that is within the First Nations Leadership Council's plan that I talked about. They have a really great lens that talks about the different steps that you can take in creating policies or taking different actions. I don't know, hopefully that provides some background, but I think that communities have different needs, and I think it's just really good to keep the conversation open and to build partnerships with Indigenous communities.
Thank you, Denise. That's very helpful. I think we have time for one more question at this point, and we'll move to more questions at the end. This is a question for Luke. Can you talk more about how we're incorporating natural solutions when mitigating or adapting to flooding?
Yes, thank you. So I think that the best example I would have is the Green Shores program, which is a program that's run by the Stewardship Center of BC, but in collaboration with a number of local governments. So what that approach is essentially mimicking natural systems to absorb and handle the force of the waves on coastlines. So it does apply to river systems as well, but I'm most familiar with it in a coastal context. So rather than building hard walls, hard vertical walls, a natural approach would establish a natural beach profile that gently breaks the waves. So there's a lot of really good research going on right now. So not only the Green Shores, but there's also research into things like the role of large woody debris in protecting our coastlines, or the role of kelp beds, or the role of marshes. All these natural systems actually do a fantastic job of mitigating storm forces, both in rivers and on coastlines. So there's lots of good examples. I'd be happy to talk about it for the next hour.
We need to do another webinar, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for answering the questions so far. We will get to some more questions in a little while, but we'll just move now to the next chapter lead author, Harry Nelson, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC, and of course was the lead author for the forestry section.
Thank you, Jim. And I'd also like to acknowledge Dave Spittlehouse, who we worked on the chapter together. So I think it's jointly both of ours. And I'm sorry Dave can't be here as well too. It's a bit daunting to try to cover all of forestry in BC, given both the diversity, kind of ecological diversity, cultural diversity, and everything else. I think there has been an awareness, certainly going back, as the minister alluded to, in terms of the mountain pine beetle, that we are seeing climate change impacts and have seen them for nearly the last 2 decades. And we see further and further evidence of those basically risks, mainly currently through increased disturbance. Fire is first and foremost in everybody's mind and comes at the top of the list. And I guess the one kind of common thread for all this is, whatever it is, as Luke talked about earlier, we've sort of built our forest management system and expectation on kind of the past carrying forward into the future. And, that's starting to break down because these disturbances pose risks, whether we're worried about habitat, biodiversity, or timber supply. One thing I guess I would say here, forest resilience, part of this is coming to an agreement about what resilience we're building towards what. I think we have made progress that I can probably speak to more in the questions, around trying to kind of advance policy and actions on the ground. Next slide, please. One of the things that, along with kind of the ecological benefits and ecosystem services forestry brings to us, is the importance it still plays in the provincial and in regional economies. And this is a simple way to sort of see that. And here, this sort of shows what the projected timber supply was in the province, where we see it coming down in response to mountain pine beetle, accentuated and aggravated to some degree by those wildfires that are sort of caught in late 2017, 2018. And my expectation would be that this number, those lines, that top blue and red line, will come down even further as we're sort of trying to get caught up with kind of the increasing pace of disturbances we've seen in recent years. And associated with this are the kind of economic impacts as we have less harvest available and less kind of economic activity associated with that. Next slide, please. That said, we sort of talked about kind of thinking about seeing some of these impacts. 2 good examples and case stories that we have in the chapter speak to sort of looking ahead. And part of this is thinking about, in a changing climate, kind of how might we need to adapt kind of the species or perhaps the provenance as well of the trees that will be growing up in that future climate. And so the province has essentially done the groundwork to lay out guidelines and tools such that licensees and others working have the ability to choose and select kind of species and seeds that will be better adapted for the future. The other case story here, we have a picture of a wildfire, which is unfortunately becoming far too common, something that we worry about and we see. And we speak to it. The example that we give is in the Harrop Proctor Community Forest up near Nelson. And here too, the ability of the community to kind of start to approach the kind of increasing risks from wildfire there and having the opportunities and the tools. Plus, I think I want to also go back to what Luke said, developing kind of the social acceptability to actually start to undertake activities to sort of mitigate those wildfire risks towards targeted logging, stewardship activities to kind of reduce the risk that wildfire will impact the community of Nelson. We also see other examples. One we didn't have time to talk about was up in Honeycoutine, where we see the introduction of cultural burning as a way to sort of improve forest stewardship and perhaps create a more resilient land base and something we hope to see more of. I think the next slide, please. And I think that's it. I'm more than happy. The one thing I would just simply note as a theme from the chapter, as we do look at this, I know forestry, we do have to remember that one of the key conclusions from our chapter is there will be a lot of changes happening to our forests across BC. We only harvest within a portion of it. So we will see a lot of autonomous adaptation taking place in these forests. To the extent that we can undertake stewardship activities or other things, they will be somewhat limited by the existing infrastructure and resources that we have. And thank you. I'm happy to answer any more questions as we continue on.
Thanks very much, Harry. So we will move now to our next speaker, Dr. Natalia Melanchuk, who was the chapter lead author for the agriculture section and is also a water policy advisor for the BC Ministry of Land, Water and Resource Stewardship. So thank you, Natalia.
Thank you, Jim. You can hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. So I'd like to start off by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the Secwepemc Ulu, or the Secwepemc territory in the interior of BC, and also just acknowledge my co-authors, Anna Stemberger, who's with the Ministry of Agriculture and Food, where I was when I wrote this part of the chapter, as well as Nicole Goldring, who is up in the Yukon working for the territory there. So jumping into talking about agriculture and adaptation in the context of programming. So to give you the quick overview, not surprisingly, climate change will and have some impacts on agriculture producer in BC, and already is having those impacts due to changes in production, increases in crop damage, water shortages, flooding, wildfires, and smoke damage to crops, and changes in the interactions between crops, weeds, and insects or pests. So climate change is not experienced the same way throughout the province and provides both benefits and challenges to the agriculture sector. At a very broad regional level, to sum those up, on the coast, longer and warmer growing season could permit higher yields and more diverse crops in the Fraser Valley and on southern Vancouver Island. However, warmer and wetter winters and springs could increase the risk of extreme precipitations, floods, pests, and delays planting and harvesting. This very, very current, the flooding in the Fraser Valley is an example of this, with the biological, chemical, and physical impacts to soil, crops, and infrastructure, as well as the loss of livestock that happened in the late fall last year. Shifting to the interior of the province, You see that, there may be regions that are more suitable for vineyards and orchards, and annual crops could extend north into higher elevations, and the grazing season for livestock could be longer. But on the flip side of that, there may also be increased drought and wildfires during the summer and fall. And these impacts even aren't as clear cut as this, one region versus the other. At the same time, and on the island in the Cook-Sila watershed, fish protection orders under the Water Sustainability Act have been issued for 2 years now, in the summer, leading to specific water users, including irrigation for forage crops, to be cut off in August and September. Likewise, regions opening up for the growth of new crops, such as the sweet cherry example that's in the report for the Okanagan region. They may also face, even though there may be regions that are opening up that are suitable for growth, they may also face water challenges in terms of accessibility for water and dealing with water scarcity on a seasonal level. So as a result, there's broad recognition in BC that there's a need to adapt to these changes. And this has been a significant and evolving push in the BC context thus far. In the cherry context that I just mentioned, this links to conversations about efficiency. In the flooded Sumas Fraser Valley context example, adaptation is now a question of recovery and building back better to prepare for the next flood or drought, because even in that region, issues of water scarcity can happen on a seasonal basis. So there's really recognition that successful adaptation will be necessary for the agriculture industry to be resilient and to continue to grow, both from an economic standpoint, but also a food security standpoint across the province. Part of BC's effort thus far has included regional plans in particular, which have been implemented or adapted to across the province, and they have identified key partners, key partners, as well as local climate change impacts. So drilling down to that local level and actions that can be taken for adapting and strengthening resilience. There's a number of these actions that have subsequently been undertaken from the plans already, and numerous research projects as well, investigating adaptive farm practices, their application to BC, and their ability to reduce risk. Things to just provide some examples on the types of research projects, effort on knowledge development, extension, and application on topics such as conservation tillage, management intensive grazing, nutrient management, shelter belts, water storage, integrated pest management, improved irrigation system efficiency, and the list goes on. And it's specific to the type of agricultural subsector that is in that local context, as well as the region itself and what those localized climate change impacts will be. So on the next slide, just to, instead of going into a specific case study, recognizing that diversity in application is really important, I thought in this short presentation to share with you another graphic that is presented in the report, which is more of a useful tool to look at the adaptive capacity and in terms of a public administration framework that can be seen as a takeaway of the adaptation efforts that BC agriculture has had, and the need to think about all aspects of programming management when applying them to adaptive actions within an area. And this is relevant to think about in terms of scale or levels as well, because this can be relevant to establishing government adaptation programming, to thinking even at the farm level about a farm's ability and their adaptive capacity. So the figure on the screen is one that's used in BC's adaptation programming, and that in the past, and that emphasizes 5 main areas of capacity and how to break them or apply them down to the agricultural level or the agricultural context. So just to break this graph down a little bit, I'm just going to highlight and go over quickly these 5 areas. On the financial capacity area for agricultural adaptation, it's about ensuring farms can provide for livelihood, that there are the support systems in terms of insurance that can help offset the impacts that are felt by climate change, and that there's economic markets where there can be a viable exchange for products produced. From the context of government, from governments and policy and regulatory resources or capacity, there's also actions such as essentially establishing programs and services for actions such as encouraging adaptation practices, programming to help recovery during a climate emergency and building back better afterwards when disasters happen. But also policy and regulation that create rules and guidelines that allow for sustainable use of land and resources over time, that account for climate change modeling and for the flexibility needed to adapt. From the social side and the human resource side, it's about building networks for resource sharing, but also about labor and some mobility to help operate at the farm level that allows for uptake of adaptive practices, but also tries to have community support and understanding for agriculture needs in a changing climate. Also knowledge resources, recognizing that there's continually evolving information and there's a space for improvements that can be made, whether it's being access to knowledge and an informed population with skills and the education needed to apply those pieces of knowledge to that farm level. And finally, physical resources on farm to off farm. That can be anything as small as water storage, like a tank or cistern, or it can be regional conveyance to get water to an area to make it viable for agriculture, and thinking through the impacts of that and matching it to the appropriate agriculture to local natural resource availability, i.e., is there enough space of water and appropriate ecology to provide capacity for agriculture in a region? So to wrap up, I will provide you on the next slide here one example that was provided in the report was ACARN, or the BC Agriculture Climate Adaptation Research Network, which was launched in May 2017. And this is an example of a program, and its goal is to improve linkages and collaboration among agricultural researchers, industry specialists, policymakers, students, and producers from across the province. The aim of this collaboration is to develop an effective network approach to address climate adaptation research needs in the BC agriculture industry by enhancing provincial research, promoting interdisciplinary projects, and improving the efficient use of climate adaptation resources. So basically, what all this means is about extension and knowledge mobilization through the province on the ground, taking research from that academic space and bringing it to the farm level. One example supported by ACARN is the Farm Adaptation Innovative Program, which is again building capacity to transfer that academic research to farm uptake. There's also conferences and webinars that are brought forward to bring researchers to the table with farmers. So I'll leave it with this, but just adaptation programming in the province has definitely had ebbs and flows, and it's been recognized by the province as necessary to respond to the impacts that are already being felt. However, there's also for the sector recognition that there's an intersection of adaptation and mitigation that's been particularly valuable as well as BC's moving forward. As an example, through ACARN research and extension as an emergent area is that nature-based solutions, identifying practices that are contributing to adaptation and mitigation together. To dive into that a little bit more, example of management intensive grazing, recognizing it's not just about producing more plant biomass and cover to reduce runoff and make precipitation more effective and reduce the risk of erosion, but also to recognize the carbon benefit of this practice. And the best way to do this and to think about adaptation is collaboration, knowledge sharing, and recognition of this interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary need to address climate change adaptation as a complex real world issue, particularly as it applies to agriculture. So I'll leave it there, and when we come to questions, I'm available, as well as my colleague and second author, Anna Stemberger. Thanks, Jim.
Great, thanks very much, Natalia. Very important aspect of climate adaptation in BC for sure, climate impacts. I'm going to turn things back to Craig, who is going to expand a little bit on what he spoke about earlier. And so back to you, Craig.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody that's still in attendance. It's really great. It's some of the first time I haven't seen some of these speakers speak in quite some time, and some of them it's my first time seeing it. So it's I share kind of some of the excitement, and hope that you're seeing the same passion for all of these topics that I am. It's really great. So I'll be speaking to the fifth and final key message in the chapter, which for us was a really important one. it was a chance to respond to what we heard from those decision makers and experts that we engaged with, which was to try and find a way to give voice to some of the progress that we've made over the years in British Columbia on adaptation and some of those challenges or lingering issues as well. So that's kind of the intent of a key message like this. There's really never enough literature and never enough current literature or knowledge to pull from for a message like this. So you'll notice as you browse it, there's, I'm sure, things that'll come to your mind where you're wondering, you would have liked to have seen them included, and they're probably either too new or just they ended up, unfortunately, on the cutting room floor because we just had so many things we wanted to mention, and we couldn't just produce a laundry list of activities, as much as I tried to do that in one of the drafts. So to speak to the points on the screen, I think one of the exciting things to report, and again, there's going to be more and more knowledge that comes out to substantiate this claim, but we could say that there has been this a good amount of effort to implement the activities that, if you would have looked 8 or 10 years ago, even, you would have seen a greater prevalence of planning, whereas now we're seeing a lot more initiatives that are in the implementation phase, which is very heartening, because we all know that a plan is all well and good, but it's really about generating the impact that we want, that is the most important. And on that note, and to preview something from the next slide, it came up earlier, but measuring the impact of our efforts is one of those emerging issues, not just in British Columbia and not just in adaptation across the country, but just generally in this field. I think that we provide some examples here. There's examples elsewhere in the assessment. The Cities and Towns chapter talks about it, and I know that it's covered elsewhere as well. But really trying to measure and evaluate the impact of our initiatives is another important horizon and activity that many of us will be engaging on in the next 5 years for sure. So let me see. The work continues to be supported in British Columbia by what we call a mature, or we say that the work continues to mature. The field is in a relatively mature state. It's always evolving, but we generally see good support in terms of climate data and decision support tools. As I mentioned before, I think funding is one of these very difficult issues. You kind of paradoxically hold two conflicting points of view, where you're very heartened to see new funding come online, and you're also quite worried about the extent of funding needed. And our chapter does reflect some of the thinking on that by quantifying some of the impacts that we've seen through the recent extreme events. And also it does bear directing folks who are interested in that dimension of adaptation to the 6th chapter, called The Cost and Benefits of Adaptation, I believe, on changingclimate.ca as part of the national issues volume. But I will just say that what you'll find in the chapter is, a good number of examples of adaptation from across a multitude of sectors. So within the provincial government, public sector organizations like BC Housing or some of the health authorities, BC Hydro, and of course, the leadership that we see from local and regional governments and First Nations, from researchers, community-based organizations, and now even the private sector and citizens. So it's as the third point says, we don't know whether this will be sufficient. We know that there's much more activity that's needed, but it's hopefully an inspiring read to get a sense of some of the other things that weren't covered in the other sections of the chapter. And we'll go to the next slide, and I'll just briefly touch on some of the emerging issues here that we were able to identify in the chapter. And there is this tension, and it's probably quite evident for many of you that work in this space, between being reactive and proactive. And I think that both communities are tuning in. And by that, I mean, I think the emergency management community is really mobilizing, and I think we've reflected that using the existing knowledge in the chapter to increasingly incorporate climate change, for example, in hazard, risk, and vulnerability assessments that are mandated for each local government to complete. And I do think that those that are thinking more about those longer term changes, medium term changes, are also now becoming more conversant in the emergency management kind of paradigm. So But certainly one of those important issues. I spoke to the second bullet to a certain extent already. The chapter does detail some of those needs that we were able to identify in the knowledge around needing, for example, regional and sector-based cost and benefit analysis. We've got some really promising findings that we can point to, certainly more promising than 5 years ago. But more work is always needed there to provide decision makers with those persuasive elements, persuasive economic elements that they need to make their decisions. And I mean, there's still a need for flood maps. There's still a need for, UBCM has recently released funding on heat risk mapping. So there are still some of those foundational products that are needed, in addition to, project funding and some of the other things that are mentioned in the chapter. I will, I'll say, well, just to finish the last two bullets before a short closing thought is that I think Denny and elsewhere in the chapter, we've been able to touch on the essential role of Indigenous leadership. And Denny pointed to the strategy that's recently been released on April 22nd, and its first pillar is touches on the rights, title, and jurisdiction of First Nations and just how central that is, centering that work and centering those communities and really addressing those legacy governance issues. So I think there's a big opportunity. And again, for those of you that are tuned into this, there's a lot happening in that space, a lot of positive work, I think. So, but definitely one of those emerging issues, along with just the imperative to continue to include reconciliation in our work. So I think the last thing I'll say is that we know that further action is needed, and we say that in the chapter, that the current level of activity is likely to be insufficient, but that there is, I think, personally speaking, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. I think we just need to continue to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and to just continue to all work in earnest on this. And to preview a question that Louise Conway asked in the Q&A, Fiona might speak to this more if we have time, but we do hope that the results from this chapter, and we know that the folks that are shepherding the National Adaptation Strategy have these in their hands and are using them to get a sense of how to prioritize and make sure that their activities in that strategy are risk informed and reflect not only the risks that are faced, but also those priorities that are identified in a chapter like this and elsewhere in the assessment. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jim for our final Q&A, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks very much, Craig. And so we do have some time for a few more questions as well. So we'll just add some of our speakers here to the spotlight. Perhaps there has been some conversation back and forth in the Q&A panel online, but it might be helpful. Some of these I think would be helpful for people to hear about as well. One was just around question around, I guess this is for Harry, more around that question was whether, there's a lot of wildfires that are started by a human influence. Are there any quantifiable reduction risks associated with education, penalties, et cetera, that could be shared with decision makers? And there's some discussion around insurance or research that's been done to whether this is has been looked at. Do you have any thoughts on that, Harry?
Thanks, Jim. I feel challenged to try and pull together. There's a lot going on in that question. And my response, if you didn't see it, was I think I have seen some studies that have looked at measurable differences in things like closures of reducing the risk of wildfire start, and with it, presumably the risk of wildfire spread. I think that that's probably a useful tool on the margin for bringing some of those risks down. But really what we're concerned about, and you just have to look south of the border, is when we get these larger events. And we've already seen this in 3 of the last 6 summers, when many of the fires that get started start simultaneously. Their natural starts and lightning, and conditions and weather are such that it's very difficult to get a handle on those. And from that regard, these sort of tools to try and limit human starts, I guess, pale in the kind of risks that are posed. We do talk about in the chapter, kind of going back to the insurance argument, that there is a program called Fire Smart that we talk about that does try to sort of, given the fact that there are going to be wildfires, what communities and homeowners can do to try and reduce the chance that fire will spread into their community and cause damage within it. And I do expect that we will see, and we've started to see, wildfire risk starting to get priced into insurance that may start to kind of accentuate or further support that change. So yes, to some degree, insurance can help, but there's also these sort of larger kind of extreme risks, kind of like the atmospheric rivers and such, that that kind of overwhelms kind of even to some extent our ability to deal with it, even through tools like insurance.
Thanks, Harry. A question for Natalia. Are regenerative farming along with gray water reuse being considered as viable solutions for agricultural practices? What are the challenges of implementation?
I was actually just messaging with Anna on the side to see if she had any input that she'd like to add here. Anna, are you on and would like to respond to this?
Yes, the Ministry of Agriculture is developing programming around regenerative agriculture, and it's already integrated in some of our existing programming, such as the Environmental Farm Plan and the Beneficial Management Practices Program.
Okay, thanks very much. Some of these questions are, I guess, are for speakers from previously, so maybe we'll, if you could, I don't know how many people we can spotlight, Aaron, but there was a question here for Luke around, you know, what is a climate event and the sort of source of information around seeing that climate change is increasing the strength of atmospheric rivers and those events coming more frequently. Are you able to speak to that, Luke? Oh, is Luke? Luke's gone. Okay, we've lost Luke already, unfortunately, so we'll have to follow up on that one later. A question for Fiona. Just looking forward, the Canada's National Adaptation Strategy was mentioned. How will adaptation guidelines from the recently released report on BC and the climate assessment process generally be integrated within the current ongoing development of the National Adaptation Strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And I think Craig did touch on this briefly. So, I mean, our assessments really are designed exactly to inform strategies like the National Adaptation Strategy. So to date, we have been providing them, as Craig said, with copies of everything that we've completed. So the BC chapter just being out today, we'll have to provide that afterwards. They're there to inform. Going forward, it would be great to see the knowledge gaps and emerging issues that are identified and that the authors spent so much time researching and supporting with such confidence. I'm hoping that they'll inform action going forward under the National Adaptation Strategy. Can't say for sure, but also our reports really do provide a benchmark sort of on the state of adaptation right now, the current state. So, it'll be interesting to look 5 years down the road when we're publishing our next round of assessments where we've made progress, and that will, that's somewhere where we can look at how the National Adaptation Strategy actually made a difference in terms of advancing adaptation in Canada.
Great. Thank you very much, Fiona. Well, I would just, I think we're coming close to the end of our time here. So I would just like to make a few closing remarks. First of all, to thank all of the speakers and chapter authors who've shared their knowledge today. I think there's a tremendous amount of work to be able to boil down what you've done in a few minutes is that's harder than doing a long presentation. So thank you for doing that for our benefit. Of course, the chapter is there for us to read to get all the details. Secondly, I'd like to thank everyone who came today to listen and learn, and for all the great questions that we had. I think we were able to get to many of them, and there's a few more here that hopefully we can get additional answers to. We don't, even with the great group of experts that we have here today, we don't have all the answers. But reports like this can help us better understand what we do know, what we don't know, and help to inform our actions. So thank you very much. This is a great milestone, a great piece of information for those of us working in this space. And thank you for all of the work to communicate this. So I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and take care, everyone.